And welcome. My name is Alexander Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers United for Justice, NYUJ, and we are delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion on data in the criminal justice system in New York State and what is missing from it. NYUJ is a coalition of 13 local and national organizations all working together to bring common sense criminal justice reform to New York State. And at no time was New York State's lack of coherent and cohesive data brought into starker relief than following the passage of pretrial reform in 2019. Since then, opponents to criminal justice reform have misinformed and misled the public and at times outright lied about the consequences of those reforms and others. And it left advocates like us and so many people working on this issue on their back foot without clear and concise data that can demonstrate the impact and the positive impact of criminal legal reforms in New York State. Our efforts are constantly mired by those who oppose this work for political purposes or any other reason. While reformers know the truth about the impact of these reforms from other states and from the excellent research done by institutions, including many represented on this panel, in order to convince the public that criminal legal reform leads to better, stronger, fairer, safer communities, we need better information. And that is why we've convened this panel of just amazing experts to talk about this issue and what needs to be done next. I want to particularly highlight the work of Measures for Justice on this issue, who recently released a report describing and discussing gaps in New York's criminal justice data system. I also want to mention that NYUJ has put forward a legislative proposal to address those gaps based on Measure for Justice's work. That's part of NYUJ's Second Chance agenda for New York, our current campaign to reform New York's reentry system, and of course, its data system as well. I invite all of you to join that campaign and join us in our work by visiting our website at nyuj.org. I don't want to waste any time in getting to our panel of experts and to hear about this critical issue. So now what I'd like to do is turn to our moderator and introduce him to all of you. Our moderator today is Khalil Cumberbatch. Many of you know Khalil either personally or through his extensive work. He is a nationally recognized advocate for criminal legal reform. He is currently the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Council on Criminal Justice. He's also a senior advisor to the NYUJ Coalition. We're delighted to have him here as our moderator. So without any further ado, Khalil, please take it away.
Thank you, Alexander. Nothing left to be said. Honestly, Alexander laid out the ground in front of us for this conversation. What I would add, though, is that, we are at a time not only in criminal justice reform, but also just at a state of emergency in terms of criminal justice reform, in terms of what the narrative is around criminal justice reform, particularly as it relates to crime. And the reason why I think this conversation is pivotal is because there are a bunch of chatter happening out in the world around these issues, but there's very little argument that can be made against criminal justice reforms when we look at the data. And so this conversation today is vital because we are going to our elected officials and asking them to make decisions on criminal justice reform, and to some extent look past the chatter that exists and look at the data. So I'm really happy to be able to moderate this conversation today. And so today with us, we have a very esteemed panel. First, we have Kristine Hamann, the Executive Director of Prosecutors Center for Excellence. We have Shelby Davis, Assistant Director of Research at Measures for Justice. Aubrey Fox, Executive Director of New York City's Criminal Justice Agency. And of course, Jullian Harris-Calvin, Director of Greater Justice New York for Vera Institute of Justice. So thank you all for joining us. I would ask that we start with you, Kristine, if you can just give some brief introductory remarks before we get into the question portion. And then after that, we'll go to Shelby, and then Aubrey, and then Jullian.
Thank you, Khalil, so much. And thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I'm Kristine Hamann. I'm the Executive Director of Prosecutors Center for Excellence. We are a nonprofit that works with prosecutors around the country. We bring to them new ideas, encourage them to evolve and turn into modern prosecutors. We conduct national meetings, write publications, have webinars like this. So we do many things for prosecutors of all sizes, because prosecutors can range in size from the big offices we know from New York City to mostly small offices around the country that have something like 6 prosecutors. I was a career prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in New York City, so I am a New Yorker. I started my career there as a violent crime prosecutor and spent the last decade on the executive staff, where we dealt with many of the policy issues that are being discussed here today. I will leave for further discussion later on. Recently conducted a nationwide survey where we surveyed over 500 prosecutor offices about the state of their data. I've also interviewed prosecutors all around the country about the state of their data, how they use their data, what they think of their data. I'll talk about that later. And it's contained in the report that will be distributed today. So I look forward to continuing the conversation and hearing what my very impressive colleagues in this call have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristine. Shelby?
Yeah, hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Shelby Davis. I'm the Assistant Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives at Measures for Justice. And Measures for Justice is a nonprofit that aims to make accurate, reliable criminal justice data available to spur reform. As stated a few weeks ago, we launched a report that really looks at the criminal justice data landscape across New York State. So I'm very excited to be here for this conversation and to be joined by my fellow panelists and the opportunity to share a bit about what we've learned.
Thank you, Shelby. I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing that. Aubrey, you're next.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate as well. I'm Aubrey Fox. I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Criminal Justice Agency. We're the city's main pretrial services agency. And so we provide a range of services throughout the entire pretrial process. But we're also a research agency. We produce reports, and we have a lot of access to data that we try to make as publicly accessible as possible, including our recently released pretrial release dashboard, some other work that we've done. Wanted to congratulate Shelby and Measures for Justice for a really interesting and provocative report. But I think in my comments, I'm going to sort of try to share a perspective that comes from our combination of both day-to-day operational work embedded within the criminal justice system and our identity as a research agency, which I think may provide a slightly different perspective on some of the really important questions that you're raising in this panel and that Shelby and her team raised in the report that they issued.
I think that leaves me. Is that right, Khalil? Great.
Thank you, Jullian.
Thank you. So I'm Jullian Harris-Calvin. As Khalil said, I lead the Greater Justice New York program at the Vera Institute of Justice. And the Vera Institute is powered by hundreds of advocates, researchers, and experts working to transform the criminal, legal, and immigration systems until they're fair for all. We were founded in 1961 in New York City. And we were based in advocating for alternatives to money bail in New York when we were founded, but we've grown to be a national organization that does advocacy, data analysis and research, publishes reports on the one hand, but also does advocacy, technical assistance, and other kinds of work around pushing criminal, legal, and immigration reform. My program is specific to New York State and specific to criminal justice reform. I know nothing about immigration, but do a lot of work on the policy level and the research level. So we do a lot of digging into the data in New York City, but also individual counties, the 57 counties outside of New York City. Partnering with folks like Aubrey and Shelby and NYUJ on some of that. And so very excited about this conversation. I'm also a former public defender, so I spent a lot of my time in courtrooms as well, seeing how criminal justice reform actually plays out on the ground, and also unintended consequences of some of the policy and the data or lack of data analysis. So excited about the conversation, and I'll send it back to Khalil.
Thank you, Jullian. If we could just start with you, just a pointed question to you, and then we'll go to a pointed question to Shelby, and then Kristine, and then Aubrey. This word is being thrown around a lot, right? Data, and data is relative for many of us. It means one thing for one person, and it means a different thing for another, especially in the different parts of the state. So from your perspective, Jullian, what types of data challenges do you see in New York? And potentially what data is missing in the discourse around criminal justice reforms?
Great question. And it's something, the answer is something that we run into every single day. And so Shelby's report, I think, really digs into it, but I think I can give you from our perspective, just like the practice of collecting data and analyzing data. And so there are about 3 categories that I think come to mind initially about the challenges around data and the obstacles that we bump into. One of them, particularly around bail reform, which passes, we all know, in 2019 and was amended in 2020, is that when we're looking at the effects of bail reform and the implementation of bail reform, we have no comparison point of pre-bail reform data. So OCA published a massive data set of their own data and DCJS data that really shows like how arraignments are happening, rearrest rates, who's being arrested for what, really robust data post bail reform. But when we're looking to see like, well, has bail reform worked? If it has or hasn't worked, why? We have no comparison report because OCA was not collecting that same data pre-bail reform. And so we can constantly, when we're talking about policy and how bail reform or other reforms, because this isn't just in the bail context, but for me, it's most salient right now in the bail context. When we're looking towards conversations around should bail reform be amended, is bail reform working, how, if it should be amended, it should be amended, we have no comparison point. And so what we would need to do then with the data set that we have is wait, right? Wait to see if anything changes between 2020 and the years coming. So that's the first roadblock that we see, particularly around bail reform. The second is, Shelby's report talks about this quite a bit, is particularly outside of New York City, it is so hard to get court data and jail data that's updated. So for instance, if we're looking at what are the trends in some upstate counties around jail populations, jail demographics, rearrest rates, are judges setting bail? How much are they setting? Are people making bail? How long does it take for people to pay their bail and get out? Jail staffing ratios, which are important because those drive correction costs that could potentially be reinvested in other public safety investments or even just the general fund in counties, right? All of that we have to foil, and it takes forever, right? And so then when we get the data, it feels stale. It's not useful in terms of the timeliness of the data. So that's the second, timely data, which Shelby also highlights in her report. 6-month-old data is just not useful in our rapidly changing criminal justice ecosystem. And when it comes to the legislative policy cycles, right? It just getting 6-month-old data and then taking the time to analyze it and then taking the time to write a report and get it edited and all this stuff, right? It takes a long time. And so we have this old data. So the timeliness of the data is the second. And then the third, I would say, and I'm speaking really fast because I don't want to take up all the time, but I have lots to say. The third is qualitative data, right? It's great to have this quantitative data, but sometimes we need some more qualitative data about what's happening inside the courtroom. Again, I'll use bail as an example. How are court stakeholders thinking about responding to and implementing bail reform, right? So one small example is the bail law says that judges should be considering a person's financial circumstances when setting bail, so that bail doesn't cause an undue hardship and keep them in pretrial detention unnecessarily, right? But other than looking at the quantitative data showing the length of time people take to pay their bail, we don't know if the bail, well, one, we can see that it's unaffordable, but we don't know if it's unaffordable because judges are actually not having the conversation on the record in the courtroom about people's financial circumstances. Are defense lawyers presenting information about ability to pay during arraignment? What are prosecutors saying about it? How, even if it is coming up, are judges dismissing it, the argument? How are they responding to it? But those are really important questions that can help us when thinking about moving bail reform forward and what policy changes might need to take effect in order to give teeth to the ability to pay requirement. So that's just one example. It pops up and everywhere in terms of criminal justice policy and the data needs. But so those are my three top, I think, obstacles. And I could talk much more about it, but I will send it back to you, Khalil.
Yeah, thank you. And we can all lament for days about the FOIL process in New York State. So no worries about that. Shelby, your organization, Measures for Justice, recently released a report, and it kind of gave the summation of the state of criminal justice data in New York State. Based on your findings, what are some of the key challenges related to criminal justice data in the state, and what are some of the potential implications for individuals involved in the system?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I mentioned earlier, Measures for Justice's goal is to make accurate criminal justice data available so that we can, inform our conversations and decisions about reform. Through this work, we first tried to collect court data in New York State in 2014 to include it in our national data portal. And in the years since that initial sort of data outreach, we've experienced a number of challenges, both obtaining and analyzing data from agencies across the state. And we were sort of left with a lot of questions about why that was. So I say that because, this report really stemmed from a desire to better understand our experiences there. Why did we have so much trouble, and was our experience common? And we wanted to understand, what criminal justice data collection and sharing look like from the perspective of those folks who are most familiar with it. So in setting out to do this report, we talked to researchers, policy advocates, and practitioners about their experiences with this case level criminal justice data. And ultimately, our experience or our analysis resulted in 4 main themes. You're going to hear a lot of overlap, I think, with the 3 things Jullian was just talking about. And I see these four themes as also sort of 4 categories or buckets of challenges to be addressed. I hope folks check out the full report. There is really a lot to unpack here, and I probably won't get to all of it today, but I do want to briefly talk about each of those categories. So first up, there is a lot of opacity around criminal justice data across New York State. There's this idea that data are kept in black boxes with their contents obscured from view. So several people use that term specifically, noting they don't know what data are being collected, by which agency, what it looks like, what format it lives in. And I think, this lack of transparency leaves researchers and policy advocates without, important data to inform our work. But I think it's also important to mention here, there were a lot of challenges talked about from people who also wear the sort of data administrator hat. Representatives from the Division of Criminal Justice Services and the Office of Court Administration were kind enough to sit down and walk us through their process for reviewing data requests. And through those conversations, we learned that a lot of time and resources can go into just sort of evaluating requests for data and to determine whether they have the information that would be responsive to those requests. So I say that because this murkiness seems to be causing problems all around. And again, these these are people, who work within or with criminal justice data, for their jobs. Their work centers around this. So I think if this is their experience and was our experience at Measures for Justice as sort of this bona fide research organization, what are the implications of this like obscurity for the general public and for folks who want to understand what's unfolding in these systems and how they're impacting their communities? So the second bucket or theme has to do with the ways agencies are collecting data. We found that the quality and as a result, the utility of data is largely impacted by inconsistent and antiquated data collection practices. So from county to county, between agencies in a county, even within the same office, data are being collected in different ways. And that data collection is often hindered by these, dated technologies. And importantly, though, and I think Jullian really spoke to this well, these issues don't impact all jurisdictions equally. There is a lot of variation in technology and capability across the state. And many people made this distinction between New York City specifically and the rest of the state. There was this general consensus that these issues are the worst in smaller, more rural communities. And so it makes it particularly hard to get a look into what's happening in those places and also to do statewide analyses. And I will say here, it didn't seem like any data types or elements were immune to these challenges, but our demographic information, indicators of race in particular, are really susceptible. So depending on the agency, an individual's race might be gleaned from officer assessment. It could be self-reported. It might be some combination of the two. And so oftentimes folks working with data have a lot of questions about how that race was collected, and similar practices, I think, have shaped the data around gender. Often we aren't asking folks about their gender identity. And since we don't have this data, we don't always understand the different ways in which people experience these systems. And we're really unable to identify and resolve systemic inequities that we know based on the research likely exist. Okay, so our third bucket is about the processes for acquiring data. They're very arduous and costly. So put simply, criminal justice data across New York State are going to be a long, frustrating and costly endeavor if you're looking for them. And again, this was widely acknowledged by folks, both people who typically wear that requester hat, as well as the folks who typically sit in the seat of the data administrator. But while the folks that wear that administrator hat sort of chalked this up to protecting personal identifying information, they said that these processes were intentionally arduous for these reasons. Folks speaking from the data requester side had a different take and often suggested that these challenges were often intentional on the part of the agencies. And that exorbitant costs and time estimates are one way agencies can dodge transparency. So there was one example given by a researcher who requested police disciplinary records from one department and received a cost estimate of $47,000. So when we say expensive, it's very expensive. And I think these types of estimates are really reinforcing the perception that agencies are creating these intentional barriers. And then finally, our fourth challenge is that agencies are at times selectively sharing data based on who is making the request. So we talked to two researchers and they were describing their experience seeking the exact same type of data from the exact same agency. And one said, they've always approved my request, and she credited it to her great working relationships at the agency. And the other person said, we've tried for years to get access and cannot, no matter what we do, we can't get it. So, many people suggested receiving data is dependent on who you are and who you know. And in fact, several of the people we spoke with asked to remain anonymous in our final report because they were afraid of upsetting folks and losing access to data. One important point here, a common way folks seem to feel that agencies were selectively sharing data was through different interpretations of FOIA, the New York Freedom of Information Law, and other legislation that govern data. So by providing an interpretation like, no, I'm sorry, that law doesn't apply to retroactive data, or it only applies in these instances, they were really failing we were struggling to hold folks accountable is what we were hearing. So that's just to say there's a lot of, I think, confusion around what is actually legally permissible information and to whom. So to sum all that up, it's a challenge to understand where data exists. If you're able to identify the data you need, it's going to cost you a lot of time and money to access it. Even then, administrators are using a lot of discretion in determining, ultimately who receives that information. And even then, if you're able to kind of navigate those challenges, depending on the jurisdiction and the type of data you're requesting, it's probably not going to be great. There might be a lot of inconsistencies, missing information. I think, the obvious implications here for researchers and policy advocates is that, we're left without data to inform our discussions and our decisions. I think that we've spoken to this a bit, but we're always taking in a ton of stories about the criminal justice system and crime. And without this data to really speak to what's happening at the systems level, we're sort of left with anecdotes and claims about what's working and what's not, and where reform is needed and where reform is a threat to public safety. These things go unchecked. And so I think the last thing I'll say, and I promise I'm wrapping it up, is the report, I'm a researcher, and the report talks a lot about the impact of these challenges for researchers and practitioners, people whose jobs depend on it. I think as troubling as the findings are, of particular concern were the conversations we had with folks who struggled to receive data to advocate for incarcerated clients, or stories of incarcerated people who struggle to obtain their own records. So we've heard a lot about how this obscurity and inequitable data access can have negative implications for individual case outcomes. And every time we talk about data, I think it's just important to bring it back to this point. These data we're talking about aren't abstract numbers, they're representative of someone's experience within our systems. And I think those of us who study and work within these spaces have a real responsibility to push for fair and equitable and responsible practices in this space. So,
thanks, Shelby. For those who are joining, the link to that report has been placed in the chat, so please check it out. Kristine, I'm going to turn to you now. A recent report released by Prosecutors Center for Excellence states, quote, prosecutors are often called the, quote, black box, end quote, of data, which puts a strain on defendants and by extension, the courts. What led to this kind of general trend, and what types of data challenges are faced by prosecutors?
So I want to start by saying that I agree with the two speakers who just spoke about the challenges of data. I don't think we're in disagreement about that. The report that I did brought me to states around the country, and I wanted to make one observation that may be somewhat depressing, which is that New York State may be the best data state in the nation. That these challenges exist everywhere, and from what I've seen, New York may be closer to doing a good job than most other states. But putting that aside, that doesn't mean that there are not tremendous gaps and things that need to be done. I wanted to just talk very much in general about something that we saw within prosecutor offices, but I think holds true throughout the criminal justice system, which is the need for a data culture. Our data systems have grown up over the past 30, 40 years since computers were used, like mushrooms in the night. People created data systems based on very specific needs without any conversation with one another. And there's no standards between agencies as to what things mean. There are no standards in most offices about what data fields mean, nor are there audit protocols for making sure that the data has quality, because the data culture in the criminal justice system is only just emerging. People in the criminal justice system, it's like a huge system that's just cranking cases from one point to another. And we have been working hard in many ways, and we're trying to improve. But the notion that data will get us the answer is relatively new. So the need for a data culture and a data importance is number one. For example, in prosecutor offices, and New York again is lucky because the city offices have very good case management systems. The state has there's a statewide system for the smaller offices that's very good. But for most prosecutor offices, if you want to buy a case management system, it's $250,000. It's not cheap. So you need to go to your legislature and say, give me a case management system. Once you have the system, your problem has not been solved. You still need people to add the data, enter the data, audit the data, and reveal the data. So all of these things we are still learning. And it's good news because people like Measures for Justice and the other groups here are pushing the system to try and gather data. I think the gaps in data, there are many uses for data. The researchers, of course, are very anxious to get data so they can study policy. We're all trying new things every day. New programs are cropping up. It's very difficult for us to know if they work or not without good data. But data can also help us with other things. Data can help us become more efficient. Data can help us manage our offices in a way that's useful. And so there are real needs for data. And I know that the legislature is something that is a goal of this webinar for them to hear. It is worth an investment in data because it will have so many different impacts that are not just research, but could actually save money. It's an initial investment that could save some money down the road and help people in many different ways. So what I have seen, just speaking about prosecutor data, I just wanted to make one point, and this may in fact apply to public defenders as well. This is just a small example. Prosecutors obviously are lawyers. Now, when we go to law school, we don't talk about data. We don't particularly understand data. And when we have collected our data, we're focused on our court cases. We're focused on where do we have to be and when, and what cases do we have in front of us. For prosecutors, again, going back to data culture, we're only just beginning to understand that there is more that we need to capture. I would venture to say that public defenders, I don't know if public defenders have dashboards or anything like that, but they're lawyers too. And this is new for us as lawyers as to how to handle data. But there are some sparks of hope here. Measures for Justice has developed what's called the Commons Dashboard. The beauty of a dashboard is that it shows the data in a transparent way on a website. That's number one. Number two, in order to get there, you have to go back and make sure that the data is clean. That takes a lot of work, but it's important because much of our data is not clean. And the third thing is that once you have a dashboard, it opens the mind to other opportunities for data. And I've spoken to prosecutors who have dashboards. Their goal was to make it available to the public. And then suddenly they realized, you know what, I can use this internally. I can now see how efficient are my lawyers. Is it worth processing these cases versus those cases? Are my diversion programs working or not? So I am hopeful that we are on the verge of developing a data culture across different aspects of the criminal justice system, because of course that is necessary. We all need to speak the same data language. If the police are defining things one way, prosecutors and defense attorneys another, and the courts in a third, we can't talk to each other. So dashboards is one positive thing. Vera, I know, has done a lot of work on race and equity using data. Again, they have to clean it up before they do it. I know some prosecutors' offices are doing crime strategy units where they're looking at data to see what crime is happening and how best to use it. So I'm optimistic that we're at the beginning of what hopefully will be a data culture and a data world going forward.
Thank you, Kristine. And for Aubrey, CJA collects and analyzes New York City's pretrial data, as you mentioned. What type of challenges and or successes are related to data that you have seen on the city level?
Yeah, I really love the remarks that preceded mine. And I think if I had to sum it up, I share very much Jullian and Shelby's desire for more data transparency. I think that's part of our organizational DNA at CJA. But I think I also, some of what Kristine said really resonated with me about the kind of unique constraints that practitioners operate under. And in the way I would say it is the need to understand those constraints and to help encourage practitioners and people working within the system to free their own data, but understanding also that that will only really work if there is something in it for them. And I think that's really an important thing that we should all keep in mind. I personally find this more recent interest in and enthusiasm for better data to be great. I think it's a wonderful thing that advocates and even funders are taking a hard look at this. My concern is making sure that energy is channeled in the right direction. So I think my comments would be in the realm of what I would call realistic expectations for both what data can accomplish for you and what practitioners can accomplish in trying to create the very data culture that Kristine is talking about. So one thing I would say is that, again, if your goal is to create more data transparency, I think we should be more honest that has to be done on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. I think creating better data systems tends to resist top-down legislative solutions. I don't think there's any real magic bullet answer to how you create better data transparency at scale, as much as I would like to find it. And the example I would give is my agency, the Criminal Justice Agency. So I said earlier that we have this unique status in that we're both inside the system. We play this very fundamental role in the arraignment process for every person who's arrested in New York City. But as an independent nonprofit with a research department, we're also outside the system. So we do things like publish the recently released pretrial release database. But sitting in that space as an insider and an outsider, it's taken us decades, literally decades, to get to the point where we can manage this flow of data, some of which we produce. We interview every arrestee before they see a judge, so we know a lot about everyone who comes through the court, and data we receive from other partners. It's very, very hard to do. It takes a long time to bring together data into a shared source when the data itself is fragmented and held by different agencies. And as Kristine points out, the reason that data was created in the first place was for some particular purpose. There was no design in mind that was supposed to be easy for researchers. If data is collected, it's typically collected because it has some useful purpose to the original agency that wanted to collect it. And so I think we, as an agency, have accomplished something where we can both take in data as our status within the system allows us and publish it. But I just want to give people a sense of realism about how hard that work is and how long it took us to get to that point. The second thing I'd say is a little bit of a challenge maybe to some portions of the advocacy community. I think sometimes there's the sentiment that the perfect piece of data will settle arguments for all time, right? That if we just could find at the bottom of all this opaque data, we could find that one data point, then for once and for all, we would settle the argument, whatever your political leanings are. And I don't think that's true, unfortunately. I think these are complicated issues, and that our search for the one piece of data to slay them all is unfortunately just not a realistic hope. And And I think the associated issue is that demand for data always outstrips supply. And so when I think about what we've been able to accomplish, which is to produce data that is very interesting and relevant, but includes data from as recent as January 2022, what an incredible amount of work it was to produce data that doesn't have a long time lag, as Jullian pointed out, is quite important. But I know from experience that once you put out one piece of data, then there's a call for 10 more pieces of data. That's just reality. So again, I don't think we can expect that we're going to find the pot of gold at the end of the data rainbow. When I said earlier that if we want to work jurisdiction by jurisdiction to free up more data and build a data culture, there has to be something in it for the practitioners. And a quote that a colleague of mine likes to share is that nobody knows what data can do until they see the stories it tells them. And I think there's a quality of a kind of virtuous feedback loop that can be created when you provide data, even basic data, to practitioners who are working in the dark. And then they crave and seek out more data. But again, that process of providing people answers, even temporary provisional answers, is not about settling questions. It's about encouraging people to get into the habit of seeking out information and giving them a reason to do so. And I think that only happens, I think, on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis when you have given that place a reason to do what is, quite frankly, difficult and sometimes painful work. And so I think if we're thinking about how do we channel this energy and in some cases, funding opportunities to provide for a better data culture, I think it's very important to have those realistic expectations in mind, or else we may actually do things that are self-defeating because we're asking systems to do things that they're not able to do. Whether we feel comfortable with that reality or not, we have to work with the systems we have. And I was thinking as I read the Measures for Justice report, very much along the lines of what Kristine was saying, which is, I think New York City stands alone as a high quality data jurisdiction. And the state has some problems, but I imagine that report could be written about almost every state in the country.
Thank you all. And so now I'll just pose just a general question for the group, and please please feel free to answer in whatever order is best. As was mentioned at the top of this webinar by Alexander, the kind of target population for this conversation are New York State's policymakers. And so what can those policymakers do to help improve the state's criminal justice data system? And I know that was touched on briefly in some of your comments or was alluded to, but if we could just put a fine point on it, we had a sentence to underline. What can New York's policymakers do to help improve the state's criminal justice data system?
Khalil, if I just wanted to respond to one thing that Aubrey said. There are some real choices that everyone dealing with data has to make about how to use their funds. And everyone is so crunched for staff. And the question is, what are you going to use your staff for? Are you going to use your staff to collect data and audit data, or are you going to use them, as social workers or prosecutors on the line or public defenders? Where does the money go? And so it often is really just a budget question, as to what your office can sustain. Mm-hmm. So needless to say, legislators can provide funds that is dedicated to improving data, but it's not cheap, because not only does it require improved databases, because many people are using old legacy systems that can't even contain the information that we're looking for. But once you get it, you have to hire people who can feed it. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch when it comes to funding.
Thank you, Kristine. Anyone else?
I feel like maybe Aubrey's probably and Shelby are better situated to answer, but I think from my external user perspective, I think in addition to the funding, I think Kristine hit the nail on the head there. A lot of times when we reach out to folks and we ask for data, like, we've got 3 people here. We would love to give it to you more quickly, but you'll see it in 6 months. So that's one thing, definitely the staffing and the money for the staffing. But going back to my point about outside of New York City, like the 57 counties and how, and Shelby talked about this too, how difficult it is to both get the data, but also get it in a format that's useful, not coffee stained PDFs from 3 years ago, which we do get. I think just creating some kind of accountability mechanism or a centralized way, and this might be to Kristine's point of the systems that are being used and funded for the state, for the counties, if everyone's using the same system or formatting that is funded, and there's some funding for like that startup cost as well to get these implemented, and then perhaps there's a better way for accountability on what those individual counties are producing, I think would be helpful too. I hope I said that articulately.
I guess the only thing I'd say is that I think it works best. The desire to create more of a data culture works best when you have practitioners in place who see the value in creating data systems that support the work they're doing. And so I guess it feels like there's a necessary constraint in there in which you need to be able to support and identify practitioners and show them the value of creating data in a way that isn't so overwhelming that it isn't practically possible to do the work well. I think while that sounds pessimistic, I think the optimist in me would say that there is a lot more appetite and interest and awareness of the need to gather data to support the work that you're doing, and there is more interest in reforming criminal justice systems. So I guess if I had to make one recommendation to the field, it would be if you have energy to spend, to try to burrow more into finding those people within existing systems who can be your advocates and your partners, and to resist the temptation, I think, to use a strategy that is not aligned with supporting those practitioners. Because I think it is easy to point out the flaws in the system and to make an argument for more investment or common measures. And those are all important. I don't deny any of that. But I think the way to make real change has to come from within, because ultimately the people who hold the data are in fact people who work within these systems. So I think there's a bit of realism here that you have to accept that this is a constrained strategy because you can't do it all at once everywhere. But I think it is a little more realistic, and it's a little easier, I think, to do now, given the kind of collective interest and appetite people have for data to support the work that they want to do.
I just want to back up Aubrey with just a human observation, which I think he sort of hit on, which is people are not going to, if you tell people you have to enter data and it doesn't benefit them, they'll do it for a while you're watching them. But as soon as you stop watching them, they're going to stop. And so you do have to find these reasons where it's helpful. I mean, I know when I helped develop some of the data systems in the Manhattan DA's office, and we would basically trick the lawyers into entering data. They thought they were writing motions and stuff, but we were actually capturing their data. So you have to make it so it's sustainable in a way, and that's that's a skill in itself, because there's nothing like, we've seen data drop off easily. You know, you have some kind of initiative and people track it because people are whipping them into shape, and then it drops off.
Yeah, and that speaks to the point that you made earlier, Kristine, about creating a kind of culture of data, or data culture. And so, you just mentioned one, right, which is you have to kind of make this long-term sustainable system and culture. I wonder what do others think are some kind of very feasible, simple, or maybe complicated, but necessary steps for prosecutors' offices across the state to actually take to actually begin to implement or build on top of a potential already existing data culture within the office.
Are you asking me? 'Cause I'm not-
That's to anyone.
Yes.
What are one or two things that you think or that you've seen work that some prosecutors' offices can actually implement? Because to Julian's point again, right? New York City is one thing, that's 5 counties, but the other 57 counties who are facing budget constraints and staffing constraints. What are some of the things that they can do as well?
I think it's all about leadership. And if the leadership says that entering good data is part of what we evaluate you on, you're going to start getting better data. If you evaluate people using data, you're going to start getting better data. So I think it's using data in your day-to-day operations, much like Aubrey's saying, and making everyone understand that data is important. We saw this with ComStat. I mean, I started going to the ComStats. I happened to be the person who went to those from the Manhattan DA's office in the 90s. The police never knew what was going on in their precincts, and suddenly they were held responsible using data. And that created more and more of a data culture. So bringing that data culture to lawyers is a challenge. Lawyers always find nuances and exceptions and this and that. But it's all in the leadership, incorporating data in every meeting that they have, in their discussions, in their questions. And then little by little, and I've seen it in offices where it becomes just an everyday thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kristine. Others?
I mean, my guess, and it's mostly a guess, although not entirely, is that there are a lot of, I don't know about the 57 counties outside of New York City. Those are often tough places to work and very resource constrained. But if you think about around the country, I think there are a lot of jurisdictions that are really crying out for help, honestly, with the technical challenges of doing this work. They themselves understand that their data is, they may have data, but it's poorly coordinated. It comes from different sources. They sort of vaguely sense that maybe they could know a lot more than they already do with a little bit of help, but it's very technically complicated to bring together disparate sources of data into something that's workable for people. So I would encourage people to visit the dashboards that we're displaying, because we put them up in part as an advertisement to others to think about what they may be able to do with their own data. But what you see, it's like a duck paddling under the surface. You see what you see is the head above the water, but what's underneath is actually incredibly complicated. So I think if there was a way to create real technical jurisdiction by jurisdiction help, then we might make real progress. But it has to be said that orientation to providing help of that kind is a very particular kind of orientation, and it takes a lot of patience and very hard work, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, time is always upon us. We could have a conversation about data, but time is also another issue. So we have only a few more minutes left, literally 3 more minutes left. And I wanted to see if there were any kind of, 30-second closing remarks that each of you would like to make before we conclude our conversation.
I just want to thank you for having this conversation amongst us. I think having conversations across disciplines and across agencies will take us one little baby step at a time towards where we would like to be. So thank you.
I would agree with that, Chris. Thank you for inviting us and for facilitating this conversation. I also just want to underscore the importance of some of the tools like the dashboard created by CJA and these sort of public facing data tools that are user friendly and I think really chip away at some of that ad hoc transparency that we were talking about. And so I think that they can be a really equalizing force, and just want to again commend the folks at CJA for that work. You know, OCA has that data. Jullian mentioned very robust data they work to put out. And so I think, you know, providing the data along with all of the information necessary to understand it, the code book, you know, making these things very user friendly. There's a lot of power there. And so that's the last comment.
Thanks, Shelby. Jullian, Aubrey, are you guys good, or do you have some closing thoughts?
I mean, the only thought I had is one, thank you all for doing this. And I think it's really heartening that our policymakers are looking to the data to help drive policy in a way that I think is fairly new. I think a lot of policy is it's politics instead of being evidence-based and data-informed. And I think the fact that places like CJA and I mean, all of our organizations try to make sure that the data is intelligible for folks that aren't data folks like me, and to share that with our policymakers, and policymakers care about that now. I think that's, I think that's a success for us data nerds, and for just New Yorkers overall. So thank you, Khalil and Alexander, for having this conversation, because I think we don't talk about that enough.
Thanks, Jullian. Aubrey?
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Khalil. Thanks, Alexander. Thanks, Sol.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Kristine, the Executive Director of Prosecutors Center for Excellence, Shelby Davis, Assistant Director of Research Measures for Justice, Aubrey Fox, Executive Director of New York City's CJA, Criminal Justice Agency, and Jullian Harris-Calvin, Director of Greater Justice New York for Vera Institute of Justice. And thank you all for joining us in this very pivotal and timely conversation. All of the reports that were mentioned were dropped into the chat. There are links available for that. There will be a follow-up email that will also have those links as well. Thank you for joining us, and let's just keep pushing forward towards meaningful reforms in New York State.